Tensions between China and Taiwan are being described as the worst in decades. This after Beijing ordered waves of warplanes to fly repeatedly over Taiwan's air defense zone, prompting accusations of intimidation. China's head of state, Xi Jinping, warned ominously that, as he put it, it has never ended well for those who betray the motherland. The US, meanwhile, has cautioned China against any further provocation. So on to the point, we ask, dangerous territory. Is Taiwan next on China's list? Well, thanks very much indeed for being with us here on To The Point. And I'm joined here in the studio by my Deutsche Welle colleague, Melissa Chan, who presents DW's News Asia show. She says Xi Jinping has gone after China's Uyghur minority, then Hong Kong, and even its tech billionaires. So why wouldn't he go after Taiwan? Also with us is Gudrun Wacker, a China expert from the German Institute of International and Security Affairs, who believes that China's saber-rattling is a message to Taiwan that the balance of power between the two sides makes unification inevitable and resistance pointless. And a very warm welcome too to Felix Lee from the Berlin-based daily The Taz or Tageszeitung, who spent many years as a correspondent in Beijing. And Felix asks, will China go for the military option? That, he says, depends on the US and its allies. Certainly Xi Jinping will not risk a full-blown conflict with the West. Thank you, all three of you, for being here and for those comments at the beginning of the show. Really interesting stuff. I'd like to begin with Melissa Chan. It's the grimmest time in more than 40 years, says Taiwan's defense minister. Is he right? Is it that bad?
I think the tricky thing with all of this is it's very dependent on one person, Xi Jinping, and we don't have access to his thoughts. We can see what he has done in recent years, and as I mentioned to you, he has tried to consolidate what he believes is the periphery, right? So his actions in Xinjiang against the Uyghur minority, his actions in Hong Kong. So it is reasonable to ask and think about the possibility of Taiwan being next.
On the one hand, Xi Jinping, he talks about peaceful unification of China and Taiwan. Peaceful is the word there. And then on the other hand, we have this major provocation of the incursions over the air defense zone. How does it all add up?
Well, I think that's very confusing, as you point out. He talks about peace and then he sends jets. And so if you're in Taipei, I think it's reasonable for the person in charge of protecting the island to talk about this concern and to prepare for it. And I think it gets really tricky because we've seen this in history, right? Cases of countries anticipating an attack and preparing defensively in their military. And with the benefit of hindsight, we can say, well, actually, in the end, it looked like they were ratcheting up tensions. But we just don't know. And so Taiwan is in a really hard spot where if it talks about military preparation, there are accusations, particularly from Beijing, that it is ratcheting up tensions, and even some people in the United States in terms of policymakers. On the other hand, what are you supposed to do? Just sit back? It's very irresponsible if you're a government official not to prepare for the worst and hope for the best for all cases, whether it's military or healthcare or education, right?
OK, well, Gudrun Wacker, what do you say about all that? Why is this happening now, this steep rise in tensions?
Well, actually, incursions with fighter planes have happened before. Yeah. And some might just be military maneuvers that the Chinese are doing without any actual reason, you know, that triggers this response. But we have seen a lot of activity. There might be some domestic reasons. I mean, it was, you know, around 1st of October and the 10th of October. So we saw it in the early days of October. There was more activities. There is the signaling to Taiwan to intimidate them. I think this is really part of the strategy to intimidate Taiwan, to demonstrate how powerful China is. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they will follow through. I think the idea, including of Xi Jinping, is to win without fighting. This is the ideal. Therefore, he speaks about a peaceful reunification.
Why then does he choose provocation and aggression rather than cooperation and compromise?
Well, I mean, I don't know provocation. What the zone these planes flew into is the air defense identification zone. It's not the airspace of Taiwan. So this is a unilaterally declared zone that is adjacent to the airspace of Taiwan. And there are just rules that you have to identify yourself if you fly into this zone. By the way, this zone extends to mainland China, the Taiwanese Addis, as it's called in short. So provocation, it's this, you know, what the same tactic that China used in the South China Sea. We go 2 steps forward, then we pull back a little bit, we go forward again, we push, and then in the end we have established facts like the presence of Chinese fighter planes in this area not being normal that are irreversible. And this is the Chinese tactic. So it's putting pressure on Taiwan without going over the red line of actually provoking a military response.
Felix,
Yeah, I totally agree, but it's still also a clear sign towards Washington and maybe the rest of the world. I mean, after the terrible years of Donald Trump, where there was no Asia strategy at all in Washington, of course, Biden has a much better team behind him who knows about the situation, about the conflicts, and they're trying to build up a new strategy or a strategy trying to get as many allies in the region as possible. And of course, against China. And so all these military provocation from China is also meant as a provocation or a sign to the US. Watch out. And so.
I would just point out, though, every time China sends planes into this airspace, Taiwan does have to respond. Their air force is much smaller. And so you're essentially depleting them, exhausting them in a way that, you know, does not do the same for China when they deploy planes. It's a very smart strategy of wasting Taiwanese military defense money. Every time you send one of these jets up into the air, it's a lot of money. This is not like wheeling out your car. So I think we have to keep that in mind, that there's a lot of stuff going on when they do this. It could be a signal, it could be a provocation, however you read it. But there is a fact, and the fact is that the Taiwanese military is wasting a lot of money if this is not meant to be an attack and just for show.
Is Taiwan on China's list? Does Beijing have a list, as I suggested at the beginning of the show, or is that a tendentious use of language by a sort of a hysterical Western journalist?
I think it's really hard to say. As I said, we just don't know how to read Xi Jinping. And did we expect at the start of his leadership that there would be 400 detention camps in Xinjiang? Even for a critic of China like I am, where I eye the country and look at the authoritarian state and look at its human rights record, I wouldn't have imagined that. Would Hong Kong be in the state it is today? I don't think I would have predicted that. So I think that, you know, there's a tendency whenever you talk about China to predict things. And the scary thing about all this, and this is why I caution that we should not completely write off the table the possibility of something military, is that we have not predicted correctly what Xi Jinping would do in Xinjiang and Hong Kong.
OK, before we continue, let's just 1 second. Let's get a feel for the escalating tensions that we've been talking about between China's communist rulers and the self-governing island of Taiwan.
Taiwan counted 149 warplanes operated by the People's Republic of China, which entered the Taiwanese air defense zone in several successive flights. A blatant act of aggression against the small neighboring country. A few days later, China's leader Xi Jinping followed up with a verbal threat. Taiwanese separatism threatens reunification. Whoever betrays their motherland will be finished and condemned by history. Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen's response is firm. There should be no illusions whatsoever. The Taiwanese people will not bow to any pressure. Tsai Ing-wen visits the Taiwanese military often and with great pleasure. Taiwan may be able to defend itself against an attack by China, but the defense minister says Taiwan wouldn't stand a chance of resisting a Chinese invasion. Will there be a war between the People's Republic and Taiwan?
Well, first of all, before we talk about the prospect of war, President Tsai, Gudrun, was seen there to be adamant that the people of Taiwan will not back down. How tough is she? How tough can she afford to be? Can she walk the walk?
I think that she has no choice. I think that Tsai Ing-wen really tried to give the message, including to mainland China, that during her presidency, and now she's in her second term, she will try to stabilize the relationship, that she is open for talks, but this was refused by the Chinese side. And I think basically she won her second term without doing much herself, because what happened in Hong Kong was enough for the people in Taiwan to say, this is not the road we want to go down. So for domestic political reasons and in terms of signaling to mainland China, but also to the US, because the US sometimes doubts that Taiwan is really willing to defend itself, she has to take a tough stance. I think they leave her no choice. But she will not rock the boat in terms of, moving towards we declare independence or something.
Melissa,
No.
just give us a quick feel for how the people of Taiwan are feeling at this point in time.
I think that's a great question, because there's a tendency to view all of this in the lens of a U.S.-China relationship. What the U.S. is going to do, what China is going to do. We forget the fact that there are millions of people on the island of Taiwan. Here are some Pew research statistics. For example, 1% of people in Taiwan believe and want unification. Under 5% consider themselves Chinese, and only Chinese. I mean, a lot of them recognize that they have Chinese heritage or a historical connection. I think when we talk about this, we have to think about our values. Do you believe in self-determination? If you do, then we have to take the opinions and thoughts of the Taiwan people into account. They do not want to be a part of China. They do not want to be a part of the People's Republic of China. And they sure as hell do not want to be considered Chinese.
And looking on Taiwan society, the time is playing against Xi Jinping. I myself have relatives in Taiwan. They came from mainland China after to flee the communists in 1949, and these generations, they pretty much run the country for a few decades. They are in the minority now. They were always for unification, of course not with the communist regime, but they were somehow seen themselves as Chinese, and that has changed. And I think what is changing also, or what has changed with Tsai Ing-wen as being president compared to her predecessor, Taiwan had, in the 90s and also until a few years ago, Taiwan was very much dependent also economically on China, still is. And Tsai Ing-wen sees this as a problem, and she wants decouple also from China, wants to be less dependent on China. And of course, this makes Beijing nervous.
That makes
Can
two
I
of us,
jump
by the
in
way.
here? Because I think that we had a phase from 2000 to 2008 when Chen Shui-bian, the president of the DPP, actually discouraged investment from Taiwan going to China, but he had stood no chance. And I think, yes, Tsai Ing-wen, they have this new southbound policy that is trying to diversify the economic relationship, but in the end, companies go where the money is. So we don't see a huge decrease of the dependency in economic terms from China. It's still there. The business people are still there. And it's kind of hard to do this. And we, as Germany, also know how hard this is, because we probably would want our companies to sort of, gradually think about engagement with China and strong investment. So there is still an element of trying to win Taiwan over economically in the Chinese tactics. And what I wanted to point out is on the identity issue. I think what shocks mainland China is that the identity moved so much towards Taiwanese under Ma Ying-jeou, where the alignment between both sides and the exchanges became much more intense than they were in the previous 8 years.
And the backdrop to that you are talking about here is that there is a clash of systems that is much talked about now between the West on the one hand and Beijing on the other. What role does that play in all this?
I mean, I would also argue that we shouldn't think about it between the West, right? There are a lot of democracies in Asia, South Korea, Japan.
Good point.
Taiwan is one of them. And so it's a values thing. And it could be, I think you could consider it a universal values thing, right? The people of Taiwan had experienced an authoritarian regime, and they transitioned to democracy, and this is something they value. This is an island where gay marriage is allowed. This is a very progressive island with universal health care that was decided under a democracy. And so I think we need to think about it. And President Tsai, just last week in Foreign Affairs, put out an article where she did frame it in this way. That it is an issue of ideology. And she put herself firmly in the democratic camp and views it as a global issue of the rise of authoritarianism versus democracy.
What I don't understand as a complete outsider here, really, but I do try to follow events in China and Taiwan very, very closely, is that we do know that it took a very, very long time, 100 years, for the people of China, mainland China, to move away from conflict and from societies where life was very, very hard indeed. Now there's a new prosperity in China, there's prosperity and democracy in Taiwan. Why do the younger generation of people under 40, say, who have travelled a lot, who've been to the West, why do they not insist on maintaining those societies and not getting mired in conflict and war?
Because they see how China has changed in the last few years. I mean, in the 90s, after Tiananmen, after the crack, the West pretty much said goodbye to China just for a short time, but they did, and that it was the Taiwanese and the Hong Kong people who invested in China and pretty much built up big parts of the Chinese economy. And of course, Taiwan, this generation of Taiwanese people who went there, they of course made good money also there. Yeah. I think the younger generation sees that it's not on the same level anymore. They see China as becoming more aggressive, more powerful, more arrogant, also not only towards Western companies, but also to Taiwanese companies, probably even more. And they're afraid. I mean, it's a pretty small island, 23 million against 1.3 billion. Mm-hmm. And they're afraid. And it would be not the first time that they get sucked in. And of course, they see how Beijing dealt with Hong Kong and with the Hong Kong people, and of course, these are reasons to be scared of. And I totally understand why the young generation doesn't want much to do with Beijing anymore.
OK, of course, there is another key player at the heart of the conflict that we're discussing, and that is the United States.
U.S. Navy ships and aircraft carriers regularly sail the South China Sea. Their motto for China, stay present and ready. It is unclear whether the U.S. will support Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack, which the U.S. military calls strategic ambiguity. Because tensions between the world's two largest economic powers are rising, U.S. Congress wants to make one point clear, that America must be willing to assist Taiwan. According to a U.S.-Chinese agreement, U.S. troops are not allowed to be stationed in Taiwan, but at least a few dozen of them are. U.S. media found out that some GIs have been training the Taiwanese army on how to use U.S. weapons for months, outraging China as a result. The question that the Chinese are surely asking themselves now is, will the U.S. risk going to war over Taiwan?
Felix, the question is yours. Would the US risk going to war for Taiwan?
I think it's hard to to say this. I mean, the Trump years were bad years for the region because under the Trump years, it was Obama and Hillary Clinton before that who tried to develop a strategy in Asia, how to deal with growing China and how to deal with the other countries. And it was a backlash under the Trump years because there was no strategy. And now Biden tries to rebuild the strategy, and Taiwan is part of it. And of course, probably, I mean, if the U.S. drops Taiwan, the whole region would be lost in the American sense. So I think, unlike Hong Kong, the U.S. at least would risk more on Taiwan.
They do have a formal obligation to help Taiwan defend itself. This is what the Taiwan Relations Act says. I think the U.S., with their strategic ambiguity, they leave open whether they would intervene because it depends on the scenario we're seeing.
And they do so deliberately.
They do so deliberately. They have done so deliberately, also not to encourage brinkmanship on the side of Taiwan. You know, declaring independence, the U.S. will help us, that's guaranteed. They didn't want to send that message. But they also tried to send messages of assurance to both sides, to the Chinese side that they really don't support Taiwanese independence. And so there is this play of ambiguity and assurances. But I think if push comes to shove and China attacks Taiwan, I don't think that the U.S. has a choice. I mean, they have an alliance system that will crumble into dust if they would not help Taiwan. I don't think that this is really an option.
I think it's really interesting that there are U.S. soldiers on Taiwan now. And to be
what does it tell
really blunt,
Go on.
it means that if China attacks Taiwan, they stand the chance of killing U.S. soldiers. And that really changes the calculus for support back home in the U.S. For any sort of involvement. So I think that I wouldn't say that's what the Pentagon was thinking when they decided to send the Marines over, but it certainly complicates the situation for Beijing.
OK, we're running out of time. I've got one final question, really. In essence, what are we more likely in our lifetimes to experience? Conflict over Taiwan or unification of Taiwan and mainland China in some kind of, joyous event like the reunification that we experienced here in Berlin, here in Germany? What's more likely there?
I think one thing depends on how the U.S. reacts, but the other thing is also how the development goes in mainland China. I mean, we think the Communist Party under Xi Jinping that this is a stable system. I'm not so sure about it. Of course, we don't know how Xi Jinping thinks and how many internal enemies there are in his party. But I think it's also he has to be so rough because he has so many internal enemies. And I would say maybe for the next 5 years, this communist China is a stable system. I'm not sure if it's still in 10 years or in 15 years. So, and if China changes, and there are signs that China might change also in a positive term, then I think, of course, unification could be possible.
Gudrun?
Well, I mean, for me, one issue is the argument on the Taiwanese side that this would not be a reunification, it would be unification because Taiwan has never been part of the People's Republic of China, full stop. And before that, I mean,
cautious. I did avoid using the word reunification.
From 1895 to 1945, it was a Japanese colony, and we should also not forget that because there are historic links. So, I mean, I agree with Felix. We cannot predict what will happen in China, but I think the agenda of Xi Jinping is more domestic than, bringing back Taiwan. So I would expect for the next 6 years, not necessarily that there is an attack on Taiwan, unless Xi Jinping is painted into a corner from which he sees no other option than doing that.
OK, let's give a minute to Melissa for the same question.
Yes, very quickly to jump onto what he said. We also have to think about the possibility of Xi Jinping not being around. He's older, he's portly, he could have a heart attack, and there's no succession plan. And so that itself is also something that is really unpredictable and could cause a lot of problems.
Oh dear. Uncertainty for sure. Of course, that's all part of the sort of the troubled and tense relationship between Taiwan and China that we've been exploring for the last half an hour. Thanks for joining us. I hope we've given you plenty of food for thought. Do come back next time. Until then, bye-bye and tschüss.